welcome everybody to this panel on translational science and CSCW and HCI as translational sciences. This was very much inspired by actually some research done by many of the folks involved in CSCW, including Gary, who co-authored a paper on this, our general chair, Gary Shea, and others. So this notion of translational is, how do we really think about basic, deep research, foundational research, and how do we translate that research into application, whether it's in an entrepreneurial space that leads to startups, that leads to new products, or whether it's in a corporate environment where deep foundational knowledge is translated into the language of the particular corporate environment. Everybody involved in HCI or CSCW at some point touches this notion of the translation work, of how we take our insights and make those insights understandable and mobilized into action, into platform, into product, maybe immediately and maybe over a long period of time where we reflect on how we contributed. So that's the sort of big picture. But the panel is about really asking questions and also hearing from some folks who are experts in doing this, who have always thought about the boundary being not a boundary between the academic and the entrepreneurial, between the entrepreneurial and the corporate, and innovation being about how do we really take ideas into action and what's the timeframes. So everybody on the panel really has experience in weaving between these different spaces and telling different kinds of stories, as well as producing great research that has led to change. So with that said, I'm Elizabeth Churchill, and I'm very honored to be here. But I'm going to hand over to the panelists to introduce themselves, spend 3 to 4 minutes saying a little bit about their background, a little bit about where they're at now, maybe more than 4 minutes, because everybody has such an interesting set of experiences and spaces, and everyone has sort of moved between all of these spaces. So I would like to hand over, and I'm just going to go by little Zoom boxes that I have in front of me. So I would like to first invite Mor. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, your history, where you are now, but also some of this weaving that you have done.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Great to see you and everybody, and great to be here. Virtual CSCW. I guess I'm a professor to start. I'm currently at Cornell Tech. That explains the T's that you see everywhere behind me. Where I'm an information science, professor of information science, and also happen to be the associate dean for technical programs, which is like a chair-like role here. My research broadly looks at issues around trustworthiness of our information. I've been at CSCW since 2010, 2009. Quite some time now, including as a general chair in 2018. Anyway, it's all in the before the pandemic. Other than academia, I had multiple brushes with industry of different kinds. Most recently, I was at sabbatical at Google, actually, about 3 years ago. During my academic career, just before tenure, don't try this at home, I had my own startup company that I'd failed, but taught me a lot. I was, before my academic job and after my PhD, I spent 3 years at Yahoo Research Berkeley, which was a kind of mobile/multimedia innovation lab of Yahoo in the end of its golden days. I think Elizabeth would be accurate, more or less. Yes, Yahoo had golden days. And before my PhD, I spent a little bit of time in industry, working as a software engineer, programmer for a startup in Israel. So I guess, like Elizabeth was saying, I was weaving in and out of industry and academia and in various ways and capacity for quite some time.
Thank you, Morse. Thanks so much. Yeah, having all of those different experiences, and I think also being global, because you have touched a lot of different experiences and worked with people globally. And I think that's another part of this translation work. It sounds more literal, but it really is about getting to the culture of production as well as consumption. Andres, could you tell us a little bit about your background and where you're at right now?
Sure. Hi, my name is Andres, and I'm currently an assistant professor here at Princeton in the computer science department. I also, like more, have been in and out of academia and industry for a while. I've started after college as a software engineer at a software company, happened to be actually an Israeli company in Boston. And then after that, I went to grad school. And then I joined Microsoft Research, where I was there for 6 years in a lab called FUSE, Future Social Experiences. And then I was approached by Snap to start a new research group at Snapchat. So I started the HCI research team there in 2017. And then we hired a bunch of people. It was super fun. And then I started here at Princeton last year. And for about a year, I was partly at Princeton, well, full-time at Princeton and partly at Snap. And then about 2 months ago, our Snap team was disbanded. Like many companies went through layoffs. And so our team was disbanded, which was both a blessing and a curse. You know, a blessing in the sense like I didn't have almost 2 full-time jobs. So that was kind of nice, but also was pretty sad to let go of the team and, you know, the culture that we had built. But, you know, we had a really good time there. And, you know, I've been at Princeton for a year now, building the HCI efforts here. We've been hiring postdocs, faculty, etc. And I guess broadly speaking, my research focuses on social computing, really interested in the design and deployment of systems that enable people to, you know, collaborate and connect in new ways, ranging from systems for couples all the way to large online communities with millions of people. So I'm always excited to try new technologies, but like focusing on the same kinds of problems, like how do we enable new forms of connection and collaboration.
Thanks so much for that. And again, everybody has been publishing and being participants in the academic community while also creating these spaces for others to you know, be the next generation of production, of research, of really linking the research to action. So I think, Andres, you've done that also very well, one foot in every camp, as it were. Sarah, would you like to give us a bit of an introduction? And thank you, everybody, again for joining. And hopefully people can actually maybe pop in and we can see your faces and have a real live conversation.
Yeah, that would be lovely if we could see everybody. Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Vuig. I'm currently a researcher at Cash App. Bit of background on me. Before graduate school, I was an au pair and a waitress. Highly recommend both of those jobs. Then I went to graduate school. I studied linguistics as well as technology and media. And after graduate school, I worked at a startup for about a year and a half, not doing research, doing project management, which was, as Moore says, you learn so much when you work at a startup. It was an excellent experience. And then I missed research desperately. And I was fortunate to get a role as a scientist at the Qatar Computing Research Institute in Doha, Qatar. Guessing you have all heard of Qatar at this point in our world's history. Great experience there. I went over to do research similar to what I'd done in graduate school, which was on the use of social media in crisis and mass emergency. And while there, this is really kind of getting to the crux of this panel, I started to realize that there were some research areas that needed to be dug into that not many people were paying attention to at the time. And for me, it was having the fortune to get to know my what we call Khaliji colleagues. So Khaliji is an adjective used to describe people who are from the Gulf Arab region. I was fortunate to have colleagues who were Saudi and Kuwaiti and Qatari, and started to realize that they were using social media a lot differently than how I was using social media. And this is back in 2015. And this actually dovetailed with my with my research in the use of crisis and mass emergency, because at a meta level, what this is all about is reinterpretation and hacking. And how are people looking at a tool in a way that is maybe set out to be, and they're changing it to meet their needs, those needs being very contextual and situational with regards to an emergency, or contextual and situational with regards to a young woman living in a conservative culture and wanting to maintain the respect and the dignity of her family through her use of social media. So that was excellent experience. After that, I was at Facebook, wasn't called Meta at the time, where I was on the community integrity team, again, working in the space of what we call, well, integrity, really. I was looking at situations around how to keep journalists and activists safe on the platform. I did work on violence among young people on the platform. And towards the end of my time, I was working on child safety. And then I went to Twitter, where I worked on the misinformation team for about 2.5 years. That was intense. And then I moved on to Cash App, where I'm on the health team. So how do we keep this financial service healthy for our users? And I've been there since July.
Wonderful, thank you. And I think you've touched on a lot of what's interesting around also how do we think about the ethics of what we're doing and where we're doing that work and how it gets taken up by others, more of the translation work, which is around how do you take up what we do research in and how does it scale, and does it scale in ways that we want, and that might be part of the conversation.
Yeah, and another point to that really quickly is I've been in situations where I will say, I don't get to research this. I don't get to ask these questions. I'm not in a position, I'm not the person to ask these questions. So that's something I think we always need to be reminding ourselves of too.
Yeah, very good point. Yusyu, please, could you give us your introduction? Thank you again for joining us. Oh, you're muted, I think. We don't want you muted, we want to hear you.
Okay, well, I'm no longer muted, I hope. Hi, my name is Yishu Chen, and thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. How do I say? I don't come out to a lot of conferences these days, mostly because my, a situation kind of ties me down. However, and thank you for the invitation, really, because this is a really pertinent topic to me. I started back in 1996, interestingly, at the 1996 CSCW conference, which actually buried my academic career. I was a graduate student at the time. I came out of Columbia as experimental social psychology, fresh PhD. And in that conference, I actually got some job offer going into the industry. Then I said, okay, well, that's it. I had enough of psychology. I'm going into the industry, trying to work on some products. So after that, I started at AT&T Labs, and then moving on to Avaya and the Verizon Wireless. And some of you may be carrying a phone using Verizon Wireless service. And then finally went to HTC Creative Labs in Seattle, working on some new products. So throughout this, these years, my work was mostly on real products, like telecom products, interesting products when VoIP was still the buzzword out there. And then, so we tried a lot of new telecom services, including call center and contact centers, virtual call centers, virtual offices. All these CSCW topics were actually all being experimented at the early, 21st century. So we worked on a lot of that, and then move on to real business communication systems. So Avaya, push out a whole line of VoIP phones at the time. And when mobile was getting really hot, thanks to iPhone, and then all the companies and carriers certainly realized that there's a whole bunch of paradigm changes happening in the mobile spaces. So I went to Verizon Wireless to work with OEMs of the world, if you put it that way. So this is why, Elizabeth's first thing about Fuchsia was really interesting, because God, if you put the OS on the chips, then OEMs cannot hack it anymore. And the whole, Android thing actually started with the OEMs, Samsung, HTC, LG, everybody's trying to, hack the Android OS because there were so many UX design problems out there, and then they're all trying to correct it. And it's really good to see that the design of Androids have finally come along, after all these years. And then, so after that, I moved to HTC to continue working on HTC's mobile platform. And then VR happened, back in 2015, 2016, suddenly, Oculus came out, Valve came out, and then HTC Vive, suddenly became a really important platform for the company. So I worked on the early stages of the VR product design for quite some time until 2017. Then I decided to retire from the industry. I had enough, 4 companies and really a lot of heavy lifting jobs out there. I decided to retire, just hang it up. And at the time, my alma mater, where I did my undergraduate, National Zhengzhi University in Taiwan, called me up and say, "Would you like to come to teach?" And suddenly, that was sort of my out of the closet party. It was like, oh my God, after 20 years, I'm still an academician after all. So I decided to came to the university and have been teaching in a program called Digital Contents and Technology for the last 5.5 years. It's an interesting program in that it's a hybrid institute between the College of Communication in the College of Informatics, aka computer science. So, from its establishment about a decade ago, it was set out to be a cross-disciplined, hybrid program trying to train students, to speak in both languages. And which is why, the word translation, interestingly, is a word that I use a lot in my lecture in the last few years. 2 courses, other than the HCI that I taught, 2 courses that I also teach in the university is the design methodologies and theory. And that's one thing. The other one is design and artificial intelligence. And then, and these 2 things really involve the keywords, behind these 2 courses were really translation and interpretation. And which is why for me, it's a little hard to kind of tell them apart because I really think the whole thing is just one thing. And which is a point of view that I will probably try to articulate a little bit more coherently later. But I'm really excited, for this invitation. Thank you for giving me a chance to talk to other people who also move in and out of the fields.
Wow, thank you, because I think we're all moving in and out at different time frames as well. And it looks like people are able to start joining as panelists. So folks, if you're currently participants, there is an opportunity to come and pop in and just chat with us, which would be wonderful. So I'm going to just pose another question, and then I would love to get questions from our audience and also questions for you to each other if you want. And I'm going to just kick this off, and anyone can jump in. But I'm going to kick it off with you, Andres, because you were saying about this sort of phase of great work, and then there's been these, reduction in force, we used to call it, and you're in the academic sphere. What do you feel that you're getting from each of those spheres? And I know you will continue to be involved in industry at some level, but what do you feel are the different cadences or focuses that you have to have in each of those spaces? And I think it's very live for you right now, so I really appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah, I think each of them have different flavors of kind of research and kind of interactions with other people. So I will say one of the things that I notice in academia, for example, is that there is an unlimited supply of new ideas from students who often come and say, hey, you study HCI, like I'm interested in project blah, blah, blah. I'm like, wow, I never thought about that. Sometimes bad ideas, sometimes like really interesting ideas, but there's never a limited supply of that. And I felt like in industry, there's obviously a lot of ideas, but I feel like we get so focused on like, okay, we really care about, say, augmented reality this year, or like the buzzwords in the company are productivity and AI, and then everything is like, okay, if I want to make something bigger than just me, I should be looking into that. So I guess it took me a while, at least when I was in industry, to realize, and I guess this is obvious probably for most of you, but it took me a while to realize that, you know, in research and industry, we have a lot of freedom to study whatever we want as individuals. But if you want headcount and want like, you know, more people like engineers, designers, and so on, which I was interested in kind of doing things and deploying them into the world, it makes a big difference to focus on those things that match the keywords that, say, the company, the CTO, the CEO are talking about. Otherwise, you're doing something kind of on the side and not really at the center. So I feel like I guess that's one key difference that you know, from industry you get the deployability of some of the ideas, and also the connection with something that is kind of like you have the whole company behind you if you're aligned with those keywords. And in academia, I've gotten more of the kind of supply of interesting connections with new people, both colleagues in different departments, within the same department, students. So I feel like there is, you know, this many kind of sources of interesting new connections and new ideas. So, you know, I guess, you know, that's answering your question, like, what do you get from it? So from academia, you get lots of ideas and connections. From industry, you get kind of a channel for deploying these ideas beyond just a small academic project.
Yeah, and I think more I'm going to ask you to weigh in here, because the early work that you did, that when we worked together way back in the Yahoo Labs that you brought up, a lot of what you worked on was very prescient. And one of the things that is always difficult in an advanced research lab or in an advanced academic space is that often one comes up with the ideas where the technical infrastructure may be there but isn't yet scaled. And to your point, Andres, the business thinking infrastructure isn't yet there. And so the translation work, it requires being patient and stubborn, and more in the best sense of the word. You have done that also, which is early ideas didn't get taken up but did. So can you reflect a little on that? Because I know a lot of those early ideas still are passionate, you know, you're passionate about.
Yeah, it's funny because I think in hindsight, we didn't do great translational work at Yahoo Research Berkeley at the lab. I mean, based on, you know, the outcome, right? I think we had a lot of the ideas that powered subsequent services like Instagram, like Google Photos, other places where they showed up in mobile and photos and multimedia. But we were not, for whatever reason, we can do a postmortem, maybe not today, could not get picked up by Yahoo as a corporate, right, beyond the research lab. And so I think there was a gap there in the level of freedom that we had as a lab, and the tie into the product and the role into the product groups that were elsewhere now. And Yahoo tried to fix it later with Brickhouse.
Yes.
It was
Do you want
another.
to tell folks a little bit about Brickhouse, because you and I are familiar, but I think others on the call might not. And these kinds of spaces are showing up again. We're in a new phase of that, and I think it'd be great for others to recognize what something like Brickhouse actually was about and what it looked like.
I guess maybe Yahoo Research Berkeley back then was a kind of an academic island of innovation, and it tended to be, interested in academic output as well as the kind of design innovation working with. But as I said before, we weren't an engineering group, right? We couldn't take something out to product. Yahoo decided to play with the model they called Brickhouse, but was more like an engineering, a really advanced engineering group, not necessarily research. They didn't care about outputting academic or generalizable knowledge. They cared about playing with new ideas and putting them out there in the world. So at some point, it became the island of misfit toys. All the cool Yahoo kids that were about to leave the company, and then Yahoo just said, "Okay, go to Brickhouse." Yes. Thank you.
I was just spelling it because I don't know that everybody knows. Because I think it's an American reference, Brickhouse.
And that lab, the Brickhouse, did some great things. So there was Yahoo Live. That was kind of the first, one of the first large-scale live broadcasts. You can just go on the web and be live. And there were a couple of the Fire Eagle, which was Yahoo Pipes. Yeah, all kinds of products like that were.
Yes.
Also, all of them were great, and all of them have been ultimately unsuccessful. And I think even worse, right? At least from Yahoo Research Berkeley, I can say, and this is the very the translational idea, right? So at Yahoo Research Berkeley, at least we had the opportunity to reason and reflect on what we did. So there was some legacy, something remained, right? There are papers that people can go and read and get inspired by or follow up on. Brickhouse just went, some ideas, Yahoo Pipes, kind of, maybe there are remnants of it somewhere else, but there is no reflection, there is no learning that was done publicly from the success or failure of these products.
Yeah, and I think Pipes is interesting because Pipes actually came before Brickhouse, but inspired Brickhouse, and then was taken up by Brickhouse. And so there's to everybody on the translational science panel here, and I hope that we're going to get questions from the audience, but it's that constant swirling. And so one of the most important things about this translational work is being patient and having a look back and actually staying part of the community of conversation. Because I'm going to come to you, Sarah, because I would love for you to share with us some of your Twitter experiences, because we had ideas about what social media could be like, and we have seen a sort of evolution, and now we don't know quite where we're going. And Yeshua, it's sort of also back to the mobile world. We have ideas, and somehow we maybe stay with them and see how they incarnate in a new space. So Sarah, I would love for you to reflect a little on the evolution that you've seen from your research around, trust and safety also. I mean, we're in a tricky moment with Twitter as well right now, but I think much of that, frankly, you had talked about before as a potential.
Yeah, I would say that my years now and being in the trust and safety or integrity space has certainly colored my perspective of social media. You don't work in this space without just, you're in depth with the underbelly of the internet. So you're definitely, your view becomes skewed. I would say that what I have learned in being in the trust and safety space after coming from a more, I would say at this point, quixotic perspective from graduate school and immediately after graduate school, is consistently being aware of how tools and technology will be misused by someone. And it's often a very, very, very small portion of any population, but it will be misused. So it is crucial when any new idea, I don't care what, it could be something that is very back-end engineering. You still must do your due diligence, do what we call a red team, which is, like a risk analysis, to understand and think about how these tools might be usurped, because they will be usurped. And we're not thinking that way. Like from our perspective, we just don't think that way. But you can unfortunately, or fortunately, I guess, learn the skills to be able to see how these tools will get reinterpreted. Like I've always focused on the reinterpretation from a positive or interesting cultural perspective, but that reinterpretation does happen on the more nefarious side. And yeah, it's something that I urge all of us to constantly have in the back of our heads.
Yeah, and I think there's something about agency there, which is about getting that conversation into the top senior levels, and then see if they take action on it, right? Yishu, please go ahead, because you have been going through this issue as well in terms of the, like how do we get even a tiny bit listened at the top level translationally, such that in 5 years you go like, okay, finally that landed. So Yishu, could you give us a little?
Yeah, well, after listening to a lot of point of views, and the word that actually came to mind is culture. Because through my career, I actually have been on many different sides of the line. In AT&T, although I was part of the AT&T lab, I was never, except for a very short period of time, I was never part of the AT&T research lab. Okay, so there are people who are more researchy oriented part of the lab, who did a lot of the more bench related, basic research, if you will. But then there's also the product side, the R&D of real or advanced, forward-looking telecom, services, where we have been trying to piece all the toys together. And gotta bear in mind, that was a time when VoIP was a kind of a new word in the dictionary. So any media over IP, the protocols were actually not there yet. So we used a lot of the old, 20th century technologies. We're trying to piece together the kind of services that people are very used to today, such as having a conversation over instant messaging app, that sort of thing. So at that time, we had to deal with a lot of different types of the culture. For example, the business unit, are they willing to sponsor the technical trial or the realization of the services that we prototype in the lab? Okay, that's a different culture. And then, so then after I moved into the VIA side, everything is product, because there is no luxury for real designs anymore. Now, at the time, the enemy of the then Avaya was actually Cisco, because after with their advantages, all the switches and the infrastructures of data infrastructure, they're also invading into the space of the voice communication. So in order to defend against that or trying to recover some of the lost territory, they really need a new product and the new infrastructure equipments, PBX to go with it. And then at the time, everything is really just product oriented. You got to be able to speak the language of the product management in order to justify all the design work, whether it's industrial design or whether it's user experience design, that goes into it. And then after that, it's Verizon Wireless, where everybody's trying to defend against the iPhone. So suddenly all the players in the field, the carriers of the world and all the manufacturers of the world, and also the designing teams of the world were all trying to come together to figure out what's the next, type of touchscreen open OS devices and how it's going to change the mobile usage, or essentially how people see mobility, that sort of thing. And suddenly that's a whole different set of the future, and then also a different culture that you have to get adapted to. And then after that, it's just another product races, into mobile and VR. And at that time, and interestingly, at the risk of being the target here, at that time, we interviewed a lot of people, especially in the place like Seattle, where everybody's competing, for the best talents. of the world, every time we see a resume coming out of the industry innovative center or innovation center, we can see all the product managers and the designers kind of flipping their eyes, because in that culture is cutthroat. Okay, there's no luxury to talk about innovation that doesn't bear fruits. And then, so yes, it's a bigger challenge to actually try to land an idea and into a real product. And then at that time, what I learned from that is that in order to be a great influential designer in that product space, you gotta be able to speak the lingo of that culture. And then so the foundation of a really good translative work that actually can make some impact, it starts from the culture of of both sides. If you don't understand that culture, you don't know how to persuade, you don't know how to communicate.
Yeah. More, I'm looking at you because you have also done the startup world, right? Andres, I think you went into the startup world as well a little bit, I think. But
well,
I would love more for you to reflect on that, because that is a very different cultural language and way of talking. How you close that gap.
Yeah. I think it is different, and I think the culture is a great context to talk about translational work. So thank you for that comment and suggestion. I think the startup is a little. My startup was a little. It wasn't a culture, right? It was me and the co-founder and the people that we hired. So it was our culture, but it was a different setup. So moving from the academic world, where I guess both of them have some limited resources, but in the startup it's limited resources, and the decisions that you made, maybe that's part of the culture, right? The decisions are consequential, right? You choose that the product goes that way and not that way, and your funding ends, and people are on the streets, right? So this is it, the end of the company. In academia, decisions like that, it goes, maybe the paper will go to CHI or not to ICWSM or vice versa, right? These are not consequential decisions. So I think it becomes a lot more urgent, and maybe there's a cultural aspect there, right? That takes effect as well. But absolutely, like looking at being in companies, Google, for example, the sabbatical at Google. From the outside, I can guess, what the main problems are in the space that I worked in when I was there, and I can maybe guess what are kind of acceptable directions to address it. But it's nothing like being there with the people and understanding, how they approach the problem, and how what kind of questions they have, and what kind of challenges they have, and what they're able and not able to do. That gives you a little bit more of an insight of what questions to ask and how to approach them, even back when I'm in academia. So I think absolutely culture.
And Sarah, I'm going to point at you now, because I think you and Andres have both worked very closely in the social media space. Because if we're shifting a culture, we're shifting a culture of also bringing awareness of the incredible value and the incredible trickiness, and we're experiencing, and both of you have done research all the way back for years around what could be, and then we're seeing some of that coming to pass. So I'd love, Sarah, you first, and then Andres, to talk about that deep research around culture and the cultural moments, and how that was or was not influential on changing the platforms. Because I think everybody who's listening to this now and in the future is going to be like, how do I have an impact? So Sarah, I know you've done amazing work and you've had some great successes as well as some frustrations. I wonder if you could share a little bit of that translational work, again, back to this great concept of the culture of acceptance, as well as what's being produced.
Yeah, I would say when it comes to, quite often, I'll go back to my Facebook days. I did have some great successes, primarily around, I did actually have a couple product launches that were fully research based. which is unfortunately quite rare. And that was because many of us have been talking about this. I was able to speak the language of product. And these were products that were focused on keeping journalists. The research was born of research I'd done on the safety of journalists and activists. And I was able to convince product teams that if we, kind of like the old UX, the paradigm of design around the person with the most constraints. If we can help that person, or we can get that person to very comfortably and intuitively use something, then those with fewer constraints will also be able to use this. So my pitch was, if we can protect journalists who are covering extremely fraught, controversial topics in countries with despotic governments, then our quote unquote average users in other parts of the world who aren't, engaging in these types of extremely, honestly dangerous and violent situations, we all win. Mm-hmm. So that was a big win, both product wise, and then I was also able to push through a policy change and make journalists a protected group. Up until that point, they weren't. I forget what the terminology was, but up until that point, they were not considered protected. Mm-hmm. But that happened because I went in and I listened and I understood. And oftentimes, this is what we have to do as researchers. I had to make a business case, and I had to make a business case for integrity in that. And so I've become quite adept at making a business case for integrity, or making a business case for health. And the same kind of work had to happen a lot at Twitter when I was on the misinformation team, really having a lot of conversation and work around how we were defining particular topics, and ensuring that, this is going back to my graduate school days, helping people to understand internally that information ages. So it's good information now, but it's going to be misinformation in a half hour, because the world changes so quickly. And when it comes to how we're handling this type of situation, we need to be aware of that and know that we're not going to win every battle. So.
Yeah. And again, back to the patience. Andreas, I know that you have been around this a few times, amazing foundational research, and then trying to squeak it in here and there. So can you tell us a little bit about your journey there?
Yeah, I think what Sarah was saying really resonates with me in many ways. So I feel like lately I've been kind of reflecting more on the role of publications and research papers just in general, and I often come back to something that I learned from my manager at Microsoft, actually, Lily Cheng, who some of you may know, and she often kind of complained that HCI researchers often create projects and they think that they end at the paper and hey, I built this cool prototype and I wrote a paper. You guys in the product team should adopt it. And it's obvious, right? That you should adopt it. And people are like, I don't want your ugly baby. And so then the project dies. And then the researcher is like, 10 years later, the product so-and-so comes out from the competitor and like, I told you guys, this was the thing that you should have invested. And I think what Lily's response to that was like, that researchers tend to be like not brave enough sometimes to like, if they really believe in that ugly baby, like go and put it out there and like prove to the world, not to the company, but to the world outside, that this is worthwhile adopting. And in fact, some of the successes that I had in different companies were more things that were publicly adopted in some fashion, and that will get enough eyeballs inside the company to then turn that into something that people will want to adopt because they felt like either we were releasing something that was, maybe stepping on other people's toes, like, hey, we are the calendaring team, like we should be collaborating, but after we release something, for example. So we were privileged that we were allowed to release something, and sometimes a little bit rogue, going rogue a little bit of like releasing things, and maybe that other parts of the company maybe like have a vested interest, but we will still release it and then try to gain some adoption and some passion from actual people. And I feel like the people who don't build stuff, even the people who I succeed at this, were also people who will perhaps have influence through media presence or policy influence, and then people inside the company will listen to them rather than say, hey, I wrote this paper, you guys should read it and maybe it is featured differently on the app or whatever, like people will rarely listen to that. But if you're in the cover of the New York Times or some article there, people will, oh yeah, we need to listen to this person or this research. And so I feel like often these companies are large enough that external validation is more powerful than internal, unless you are actually deep inside the product team, which in that case you're part of the team making the decisions, and hopefully that's part of the cycle. But I feel like as researchers we often feel like the end is the paper, and to me more like the paper is a milestone in a long trajectory of getting those ideas out, and it's kind of just an intermediate step.
Yeah, patience. More, I know about your ugly babies. You have taken things out into the real world. We were talking, about your entrepreneurial spirit there and the startups and stuff. And you mentioned some of that. You pointed to some of that as well. So I'd love for you to just tell us about one of your ugly babies. And then we have a question from Tony.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh,
sorry. Okay.
No, go ahead. You share, and then more. Please jump on in.
Okay. So now the instead of ugly babies, and then what Andre just said was really interesting, because one of the first thing that I landed at HTC, now Creative Labs, and I led a user research team there. We had a team in Taiwan working closely with the R&D. And we have another team in Seattle working very closely with the designing team. And the first thing that I had them do was that cut their research report, from like 45, 50 pages into less than 15 pages. Mm-hmm. Okay, because a lot of the researchers thought, even when they're not in academia, a lot of the researchers thought that their responsibility was to elaborate, the research findings and the observations as much as they could, just to show that they're really great researchers. But in order to do good translation, you really need to pay attention to how the information is being consumed, and in that particular culture of your audience, how they consume this information, and then that nobody's gonna read and 30. Not to mention an academic, paper being published in a journal, nobody's going to read a 30-page usability report. So from that perspective, translation is also about. It's not just about communication. It's really interpretation for your audience. Mm-hmm. Right. So that's just one bit of comment I'd like to add. Yes. And more. It's to you now.
More. Yeah. And sorry, your babies aren't ugly, but I just love that phrase. You worked with the team to come up with some great ideas that later came to fruition, and weren't taken up in the company at the time.
Yeah, but I think we should have, we should have rolled our sleeves and just be ready to take them to work. There's in academia, but we're not, everybody's rolling the sleeves. I think in academia, we're not, obviously we're not incentivized to do this, right? So we get a great paper if we learn something about, and the capacity is to learn something about, 20, 30, 100 users. At Yahoo Research Berkeley, the lab, we were really lucky to have a great engineering team. It was still a research, but we could learn at the scale of, 1,000, 2,000 users. When you learn different things, right? And then you may learn different things when you have 100,000 users about the product. And it's completely different to take it from there, as Sarah knows, and from the 100,000 to it works for everybody in the world. But there's a different set of challenges. It may take different personalities, different capabilities, different expertise. So personally, I was, as an academic, I think a lot of us as academics are interested in the idea, right? To take it to some point, but not to execute it all the way. But then after a few years in academia, I was sick of that. And I said, okay, we have some interesting ideas. Nobody's going to take them. I'm not going to throw them off the wall. In particular, some of the things that we build around understanding social media data in the context of events, not unrelated to some of the work Sarah did in her PhD, and decided to make this happen in the world, and rolled up sleeves up. It was me and a co-founder that was outside of academia, and really learned a lot from different stakeholders. But it's different work, right? It's not our academic work. And Andres, I think, we should focus less on the quantity of papers, more on the impact. But it's still, we're not expecting academic papers to launch a service to 1 million users, right? That would be a waste of our time. And
I think there's a tension though, because some academic papers areas do. And then we have that impact tracking. So I think there's another thing which is around what do we track? A number of publications and impact. How do we even measure impact? In a company? I'm working on it right now. I don't know. And so it's about that. How do you measure that is really critical. And one of the things that Tony was writing here, and I'd love for everybody here to just say a little bit, because sometimes our passions choose us. We don't choose them. And then every morning you wake up and you're still, oh my goodness, that monkey is right there talking to me. And I can't stop thinking about this, Our passions sometimes choose us. And so Tony asked the question, I don't have enough sustained attention on a particular topic to be able to do what is described. But one of the things we've talked about here a little bit is coming back to that idea. It's not the parking lot of Gone Forever. It's the goodness. That thing just keeps coming back to me and I can't stop thinking about it. So how do you all manage your time? I'm just going to go through each one of you separately because I think we're going to come to time pretty soon. And just say, how do you manage what that timing is of, oh my goodness, that idea just will not leave me. And I keep coming back to it. And that's kind of my parking lot, but I'm going to write a paper about it or find funding for it or something. And I'm going to start with you, Yishia, and you can tell us because you have clearly done this and came back to academia and now teaching.
And which is why I don't consider myself a very successful academician researcher, because if you look at the Google Scholar citing index, it's mostly from the work that I did in graduate school. Mm-hmm. And I don't think I have been successful in conducting research, since I came back to so, in when I was in the industry, publishing a paper was never my concern. My concern was trying to keep my people working and creating impact that resulted in good products. And then finally, don't cut my head count. That's really my focus in the industry. Since I came back to school, my focus is on my student. How do I advise their thesis? Help them do better research, and whether I can write on those research to get publication and or reputation on my own is really not my concern. And this is where sometimes you have to do a little, pick and choose, and which is why I don't regard myself as a very successful academician at all.
But your passion is helping those students do that weaving into the future. So that's a good answer. Sarah, I'm looking at you right now.
All right. So I would say how I deal with the idea that won't leave me alone. I go back to advice I got from my advisor in graduate school. I remember, she doesn't even remember saying this to me. She's like, you just throw things at you and like, who knows what's going to stick. But she said I was struggling so badly at one point. And she said, I think I was struggling with methods. And she said, Sarah, go home. And what she meant by that was go to your academic home, go to your intellectual home. And for me, that's very much linguistics. I got my master's in linguistics, and it's very much this micro level, detailed analysis of tiny interactions. And the methods that are bound up in that type of research have served me extremely well throughout my career. So for me, when I have this parking lot idea, I go home, methodologically, intellectually, translate it almost for myself. Why is this thing in my head? How do I translate it for where I'm at right now in my mind space, in my career, in my job? What are my tasks on my calendar? And then figure out how to fit that into, my actual like job, or how I figure out how to collaborate with my colleagues that I've known for years across the CSCW community.
Yeah, love it, love it. More, I'm going to ask you.
I had a VC ask me if I want to do be in academia or be in the startup, and what is my passion, and he was actually someone who had experience in both, and I asked him for advice. How do you know what you were working on? How did you know when you were working on a startup? Were you excited by it or by the academic ideas? And he said, it's what you think about in the shower. And he was 100% correct, right? Because you know that if the challenge of the startup, and when I did the startup, that was the case, right? Every morning, shower, how are we going to solve, how are we going to address it, what are we going to do with the startup? And the other things just don't bubble up. And that's the passion. And I think when before we launched it, I think it was just the idea of something that has to be out there. They didn't have any other avenue to get out there. I didn't think it will be picked up by anyone else. And it would just, became a passion of, let's roll this thing out.
Yep. Yep. So the weaving is about those passions that choose us.
Mm-hmm.
Andres.
Yeah, I think for me, like if you look at the papers that we published, they were all attempts at doing something more than a paper. And so in some ways, the paper was a failure case, like, oh, well, we just got a paper. But I think sometimes the ideas, either through the paper or the study, we realized it wasn't as cool as we thought. And then we kind of lose interest because of what we learned from the study or the prototype. Sometimes we're like, oh, this is really cool, but the time is not right. Maybe later we'll try again. And sometimes we'll really stick to it and say, okay, this is probably the thing we should spend the next 5 years and like really work really hard. And I think part of what makes those decisions is also finding out in what context you are and how to leverage the space that you're in. So like if you are at a self-driving car company and you want to work on social media, it's probably not the right place. So you probably should, like, out of the 10 ideas that you have, one of them, if it's related to self-driving cars, maybe go for that one in that moment, or maybe move to a different company. Same way if you're in a university, right? There's certain things you could do better in a company. There are certain things you could do better in a university. So I think, at least for me, like I have like a Google Doc with all my like cool ideas, crazy ideas, bad ideas. And then I'm like, this maybe is a good time to do that because I'm no longer at, say, Microsoft, or, oh, this is better for Snap, or this is better for a university. And so then we try and, give it a shot at doing that. And eventually sometimes those things stick, but sometimes they don't, and we keep trying.
Yeah, keep going. All right, well, we're coming to time, and our esteemed general chairs are sort of in the background, Gary and Tony. And so I want to say thank you to them for inviting us to do this. And I want to say thank you to every one of you panelists for showing up and sharing your personal stories about how you sort of keep that passion going and move between these different spaces, but also how you're inspiring your students and your mentees and thinking about careers in the future, because I think you've all taken risks and gone in different directions. And I think you're an inspiration to everybody. So I want to say thank you for taking the time to share your stories and for being here. And again, chairs, general chairs, thank you. Student volunteer, thank you for helping us. And everyone who has been listening, thanks for joining us. And
thanks to our lead inspirer and head of the panel,
Thank you,
Elizabeth.
Yeah. This was so fun. So
thanks. More conversations will happen. Thank you, everyone.
So
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Good evening.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye.